welcome to the Athletic FC podcast with me, Akinwolere. A Cristian Romero overhead kick earned Spurs a 2-2 draw away at Newcastle. But Spurs again struggled to create chances, while Newcastle again dropped points from a winning position. So let's break it down. There's a lot to get into. Here for this one, we have the Athletics' Chris Waugh, Charlie Eccleshare, and also Dan Kilpatrick as well. Right, Chris, we have to start at St James's Park. I know you were there, you watched it. It was a dramatic second half, thank goodness, because the first half was a bit dire, but that's now 11 points dropped from winning positions for Newcastle, the joint most in the league. That's not good to hear, is it?
It's not. I mean, you described Romero's second equaliser as an overhead kick, and I mean, I almost think it does a disservice to every single other overhead kick that's ever been scored, because it can it be described as a rubbish overhead kick? I mean, it just, nothing about that goal, certainly from a Newcastle perspective, was good. It looks rather shambolic, that he was able to get in the room to, well, first of all, the cross that isn't dealt with properly by Ramsey, so punches the ball up in the air. Then he has loads of room, Romero, to get there, swivel up, and then contort his body to direct it towards goal. It goes through about three bodies before then seemingly surprising Ramsdale and going beyond him as well. So very frustrating for Newcastle. They'd already got themselves ahead twice and conceded twice against a side who only had 2 shots on target. Had shown absolutely no ambition whatsoever. But already this season, Newcastle had thrown away draws against Liverpool and Arsenal at home, conceding in injury time. And then, that's 11 points dropped from winning positions now in the Premier League. And Eddie Howe contributed that by switching to 3 at the back, brought on Fabian Schär, almost invited Spurs on and that pressure on, and given maybe the psychological effect of Newcastle dropping previous leads in this sort of position, it just felt very frustrating after they've won back-to-back Premier League games for the first time this season, having won their first away match of the season at Everton at the weekend, but they just can't get positive momentum on a regular basis in the Premier League at the moment. And it just, it sort of summed up their season a little bit, that game, because they could and should have had more from it, but fundamental shortcomings have cost them.
Yeah, I mean, give him some dues. Give Romero some dues, Charlie. Come on, man. 2 shots, 2 goals, bang. Some might call that efficiency. I mean, he was the one that dragged Spurs back into this, and actually, inevitably, Spurs looked like they were going to lose that game, ended up leaving with a point.
Yeah, and I guess for a team that have struggled to create anything game after game, and this was their 4th Premier League game in a row where they didn't have a shot on target in the first half, clearly it needed just something mad to sort of unsettle Newcastle and allow Spurs to create anything. And Romero, for the first one, certainly popping up, and you're a bit like, why is he there? And then the second one, somehow managing to sort of fall to the ground, clamber back up, and then shin a bicycle kick beyond about 10 players. He is an extraordinary player in person. I mean, not always entirely positive. He is no stranger to a red card or a kind of moment of madness. But yeah, he can pop up with things like that. And to be honest, it didn't really look like there was going to be much inspiration from anywhere else, because I do agree with Chris. I mean, they didn't really pose much of a threat. It's a really good result for them. And I mean, it's such a low bar. I guess they did have a couple of chances, like the Bergvall flick. But yeah, this was more just about 2 huge moments, Romero to save them, essentially.
Yeah, Dan, let's bring you in and talk about Thomas Frank, because he's praised the mentality of his team to come back twice, really. As Charlie's just alluded to, Spurs were not that inspired in that match. Any signs of encouragement from that performance in any way, shape or form?
Yeah, there were. I think Jamie Carragher summed it up really well on Sky Commentary when he said, you can take this result for Spurs and you can really spin it or paint it in a really positive way. You can say, it's a tough place to go. It's been a bit of a bogey ground for them, Newcastle, and they've come from behind twice. They've shown real grit. They've shown real character. And maybe this is a turning point. But I think Carragher's wider point was that it didn't really feel like that. And that's certainly how I felt watching most of the game. They were better than they were against Arsenal and Fulham. But as Charlie says, the bar was incredibly low. And, speaking for myself, I went into that game with expectations on the floor, really, after the way Spurs have played in the last few weeks, and in fact for the last few months. And they've got some hidings there over the years, and I thought there was a good chance that this could be Frank's kind of Christian Cellini moment of, 5-0 down in 21 minutes or whatever. That's where my expectations were. So they exceeded them, but I still thought Spurs struggled to create. They were on the back foot. I thought Newcastle let them off the hook, really. Newcastle pressed very well in the first half and won a lot of turnovers, but they didn't do a huge amount with it. And I thought Spurs were kind of there for the taking. Just on Romero as well, I think the importance of those two goals and his performance was beyond the kind of points and the goals. I think Spurs have, literally in the Fulham game, were the dressing room was kind of at loggerheads with the crowd. And I think that they really felt the absence of Son there. I think Son, would have been the guy who would have been able to go over to the crowd and just say, calm down. And Spurs kind of missed him, and they missed a captain in that day. And I think Romero is now the captain, and they need someone to kind of rally around. They need a cult hero. They need someone who can sort of calm things down when it gets like it did against Fulham. And I think he can be that man potentially.
Or even James Maddison, who, along with Son and Romero, was in that initial leadership group under Ange. And Maddison is, he's always, I think, gone above and beyond. He's always felt a lot more accessible than most footballers. And some might not like him on a personal level or like that, but I do think he does do that, and he does create some connection with fans. People, he's a good character, and he's been absent as well. So I think that's compounded that Son departure, that they've effectively been without, two of their captains from the last couple of seasons.
Okay, well, Chris, we have to talk about the penalty. Rodrigo Betancourt was adjudged to have held Dan Burn after a VAR review. From what I heard, it was that he wasn't looking at the ball. I mean, do you think Newcastle were lucky there? Great penalty by Anthony Gordon, by the way, but be honest.
I think they were fortunate. I mean, if the penalty had been given on the field, I don't think it should have been overturned. I think it's one of the. I don't think it met the high bar threshold to go to be referred to VAR and then for it to be overturned. And it seemed, Newcastle's bench were very agitated. You'd be shocked to hear that Jason Tindall was in the ear of the fourth official immediately after it happened. And obviously that doesn't influence the VAR because they're somewhere else. But it did feel like maybe that sort of pressure put on the referee whenever he went across. And yeah, I think it is a foul, but I don't think it should have been given off the field. But for Newcastle, it was certainly very helpful because after having conceded the first equaliser, although they'd been on top during the game, it wasn't like they're sort of flattered to deceive. Newcastle, I agree with Dan that the game was there for the taking with them, but they just didn't. Their final ball wasn't really there. They weren't clinical in the final third. It's not like Vicario had lots and lots of saves to make. He made a couple of half decent ones, and Newcastle spurned a couple of opportunities. But I didn't necessarily feel after Spurs had equalised, Newcastle will go on and win this. So they sort of needed that moment. And then it was a bit bizarre how Gordon held the ball, then Voldemort held the ball, then Gordon had the ball. It was sort of like trying to psych out Spurs, and it obviously worked in terms of them scoring from the penalty, but they still couldn't even hold on to that. So yeah, they probably were a bit fortunate. But yeah, I just don't understand why VAR intervened.
There were a lot of Spurs fans on social media kind of saying that was one of the worst decisions they've ever seen, and they couldn't believe it was penalty. I mean, as the, designated Spurs fan on this podcast, I thought it was a penalty. I mean, I think Chris is absolutely right. Like, that's not what VAR's for. The VAR is not there to re-referee the game like that. That was the frustrating thing. It shouldn't have been reviewed, but I wouldn't have been, at all shocked had the referee given that. And I totally understand why, having been sent to the monitor, he did give it. Like, Betancourt is not looking at the ball. The ball actually lands where Dan Burn would have been had he not been kind of hauled to the ground. So, yeah, I mean, fair enough, but why is VAR re-refereeing the game?
I guess what looked contentious to a certain degree, and I know he wasn't looking at the ball, was that by the point in which it looked like a foul, he was sort of off him. But I don't know whether that's just game tactics or him trying to, redeem himself with a possible foul. But you called this, Charlie, in terms of Dan Burn. I think January you tweeted that Dan Burn, the classic, he's big, English, and seems like a good lad, so can basically do whatever he wants. He can do whatever he wants. He can win penalties. He can score goals. Come on.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, this tweet got me a lot of love from Spurs fans and a lot of hate from Newcastle fans. Though it's actually not the most hated tweet, even in a thread, because I also suggested that Newcastle were refereed differently because they're viewed as being tough and what have you. But no, I think Burn, he's such a likable character. He's very much in the kind of classic English mould, I think. And I think he does get a lot of 50-50s. I mean, put it this way, if that's Burn doing that to Betancourt, I don't think Spurs get a penalty in a million years. I really do believe that. I think it's just such. It's a really odd one to give. I know what you mean, Dan, and that I was slightly surprised in commentary. Carragher was saying like, there's just no way that's a penalty. I was kind of like, is it not? He is sort of. It's one where you normally get away with it. So you expect you probably will get away with it because you generally do.
That's what I thought Bentancur was trying to do, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's it. But that's what he's doing. Bentancur's basically trusting, I'll probably get away with this because people always do.
But we've all played football and kind of been in a grapple, and you're both grappling, so there's arms on each other, but there's one party working harder to bring the other one down, who wants it to end on the floor more than the other one. And in that case, Bentancur was clearly the one who wanted it to end on the floor much more than Burn did. Burn wanted to go for the ball and was indeed looking at the ball, and I don't think Bentancur had any idea when the corner was even taken. He had his back to the corner taker. So it's not a VAR intervention in a million years for me, but I get why, having been sent to the monitor, ref's got to give a penalty.
Well, Dan Burn this week actually has just been given an honorary doctorate in civil law by Northumbria University, so maybe that applied in this decision as well. So
he's also going to be the voice in the Blythe Panto.
He is indeed.
So another what a week Dan Burn's having.
All right, let's move on, gentlemen, because it's 5 wins, 4 draws, 5 defeats for both sides in the Premier League this season. Where do we start with this one? Can we put a finger on it, Chris, from a Newcastle perspective?
Well, I think there's myriad factors for Newcastle, largely stemming out from a disrupted and very difficult summer. Obviously lost Alexander Isak, high profile, later on in the summer. They brought in Nick Voldemorda, who stylistically is a very different centre-forward. They've almost been evolving on the pitch. Johan Wissa, who was the striker, was signed, who was seen as most similar in many ways to Isak, has not kicked a ball yet for Newcastle. He's been injured with a knee injury suffered on international duty. And then added to that fixture congestion Newcastle have, it's been weird because until the last couple of weeks, they've really struggled in the Premier League, but they're through to their 4th consecutive Carabao Cup quarter-final, the competition they won last season, finally ending the 56-year hoodoo without winning a trophy. And in some ways, that's kept the season positive, but in other ways, it's almost like they're distracted away from the Premier League where they need to get positive results. And then in the Champions League, they won 3 successive matches. They lost in Marseille last week, but they're in a strong position in the Champions League. And I think in some ways, the big players at Newcastle, who maybe some of them are aging, maybe there needs to be a refresh of the starting 11. The squad haven't been deepened over the summer, that maybe they're focusing on those big occasions, those big nights, the Cup nights and the Champions League nights, and they haven't done it often enough in the Premier League. Eddie Howe's also learning to rotate, and then the sort of issues that we mentioned earlier about Newcastle conceding late goals. I think there's maybe a mentality issue. They haven't quite been a couple of years ago. They were known for sort of the dark arts and the way that they all said, almost like England's Atletico Madrid in the way that they applied, and they haven't really been like that. So I think rediscovering all of that has been difficult for them, and they can't be as intense as that they are at their best under Eddie Howe in every single match. That's the best way I can explain their inconsistency, but it is quite befuddling, really.
How did we put Tottenham in this, Mark? Charlie, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting hearing Chris talk about Newcastle there, because I think there are some similarities. I mean, you talk about Isak going and then Voldemorda replacing him and being very different stylistically. Obviously, Spurs at the very top manager-wise, they've got a huge shift stylistically going from Ange to Thomas Frank, so there's a big adaptation there. I think, like Newcastle, juggling Champions League is difficult, because you can't really, you just can't rotate in the same way as Spurs were used to doing with the Europa League, and Newcastle have had seasons where you weren't even in Europe at all, so that makes life a lot easier. And again, another similarity is the injuries. For Visser, Reed Solanke, and obviously Maddison and Kulusevski as well. And I think you've just got to have such a huge squad to try and compete in the Premier League and Champions League, which I'm not sure either of these teams really do yet. That takes a lot of time and a lot of money, and then throw in a few injuries to key players. It's just hard, like the Premier League is really, it's so, there's such like a similar level of quality, I think, that a lot of teams have. And, so you can't, and teams are emboldened now, especially, and obviously, I guess the difference between the two teams is that Newcastle have been good at home and really bad away. And for Spurs, you flip that. But yeah, I just think there's like a level of sophistication that most Premier League teams have now. And if you're a little bit off it, and if that's as a result of having had like a tough Champions League game on the Wednesday, then you are going to get exposed. And I think that's happened to both these teams this season.
Dan, Jack Pickbrook's piece after yesterday's match was really interesting because he spoke about the intangibles. He says, do the players believe in what they are doing? Are the fans behind the new coach and the team? Are those bonds between the fans, the players and the manager strong enough to pull everyone together? Does that make sense in what he's trying to say? It's not just obviously the players, but there's a lot of other things here that just don't seem to be working for Spurs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great piece from Jack. When Spurs have been at their best in the last decade, it was obviously the Pochettino era, and there was a kind of thread of unity that ran from the boardroom through the terraces right through the team. Everyone was pulling in the same direction, and that was partly because they had a really charismatic coach and a great coaching staff, and who instilled this culture in the club. But it really hasn't been that way at all, barring a few very brief periods like the first half season under Ange, since Pochettino left the club. And you look at the state of Spurs now, and I've been pretty vocal that I don't think Frank is the right man. I don't mind saying that. But you look at Spurs now, and all these kind of threads are broken. It looks like the players are, at loggerheads with the fans. I don't think the players fully respect Frank from what I can see. I don't think they fully believe in what they're being asked to do. And then there's this issue of the boardroom. No one really knows who anyone on the board is anymore. Levy was obviously, I think he's the most responsible figure there is for the mess Spurs are in. But he was also a kind of quite useful lightning rod for supporter frustration. Would Vicario have been booed against Fulham if Levy was in the director's box? I don't think he would, because fans would just chant, "We want Levy out." But he's not there anymore, and no one's going to chant, "We want Peter Charrington out," because no one knows who he is, and equally no one.
We want Vivian Lewis out.
Vin, I get out of our club. It's not going to happen. So there's this kind of vacuum of leadership and power. I think almost at every level of the club. We talked about the team. I don't think Frank's quite got the authority to manage the dressing room and pull the supporters with him. So in short, there are a lot of issues, and we could do a whole podcast on it. But I'm kind of very concerned about the state of the club at pretty much every level.
Chris, do we have a sense of what Newcastle are and what Newcastle want to achieve? Because like any team trying to break into that sort of top sphere of football, is it constant European qualification? Is it front foot football? Is it game management? I don't know. Like, what can we say Newcastle are as well?
Well, Newcastle have got a new CEO who arrived in September, David Hopkinson. He's been speaking this week. Some quotes to come out later in the week, and he's almost tried to reset things a little bit and put Newcastle back in this sort of sphere that Yasser Al-Rumayyan, the governor of PAF, the majority owners and their chairman, said a couple of years ago, which was to be number one. And the ambition is to really try and not just win the odd trophy here and there. They want to be consistent challengers. They want to grow on and off the field. And in some ways, that seems a bit fanciful because the owners have been there for 4 years, and Newcastle have improved immeasurably. They've won a trophy. They've been in the Champions League twice, but it's not like they are suddenly challenging Man City or Liverpool or certainly Real Madrid. But the ambition is there to be that. The problem they've had is some of the financial regulations that are in place, which sort of have limited them to a certain degree, and maybe they haven't actually grown revenue and commercial-wise as much as they want to. But I think in the short to medium term, the goal this season has to be Europe as a minimum, ideally back in the Champions League, because that A, allows them to attract better players and keep their better players, but B, financially is transformative relative to the Europa League and will help them continue in that. And if they haven't done it in consecutive seasons yet, so if they can follow one season of doing it with another, then that would be huge for them. But given the way that they've started the season, you certainly can't say that that's a given that they'll get into the Champions League, and there are a lot of teams competing for those positions. We don't yet know whether there'll be 5 through the league either. It may only be 4, probably will be 5, but we don't yet know that for certain. So the ambitions are huge, but can they fulfill them is the big unanswered question that we won't know for years to come.
From a Spurs perspective, I'm just thinking about Thomas Frank then, and I'm hoping we still see Thomas Frank as coach, manager of Tottenham Hotspur till at least Christmas. How can he get these fans on side? Losing to Arsenal, losing to Chelsea, for instance, that can't help. The home record can't help. Nuno Espirito Santo had quite a turbulent start to his Tottenham career, Charlie, and he didn't go long after that defeat to Arsenal.
No, and that did the North London derby defeat a week or so ago did really remind me of that 3-1 game, after which Nuno was pretty much done. I think he lost all his remaining games and was sacked a few games later. But you could feel it. I mean, it was that bad. Like, I really did feel it was that terrible. And the approach was, Nuno's approach that day was kind of baffling He basically played without a midfield. I mean, it was horrendous, but it wasn't so defensive. There was something about that defensive approach, obviously, from Frank, but which has been well documented. I think, I think Spurs have got the joint best away record in the Premier League and the second worst home record. And if you flip that, his standing would probably be a lot better with fans. If they were winning most of the home games. It's really tricky because he's in this position where, he clearly thinks the best way to beat Chelsea and Arsenal or get a result against them is to go in with a very defensive approach. Like that, he wouldn't have done it otherwise. And so he's now in a position where, does he kind of stray from what he thinks is the way to approach those games, certainly for now, to sort of appease fans, or does, which maybe that will work. And obviously PSG, I think there was at least a bit of like, well, we gave it a go. I think that I've always felt with Frank, like and as a fan, I think you need to dream. I don't see that high a ceiling for him with Spurs. Like I really struggle to see what's like the best case scenario, because even, you look at fans of, say, Liverpool under Klopp or whatever, there were some crazy lows, but you were like, this could be amazing. And even like Arteta at Arsenal was like basically traded off for the first year or so of like, but what if he is the next Pep? As crazy as that sounds, what if he is? And he kind of turned out to be. With Frank, I don't know. I think he could do a decent job, but does anyone really believe he's the kind of project guy to come in and be there for years and years? Like I know he was at Brentford for ages, but for him to be at Spurs for ages, he'd have to basically be challenging for the Premier League and Champions League in a couple of years. I don't know. I just think that the sort of maybe sort of anticlimactic feel now fans have post finally winning a trophy, coupled with bringing in a kind of safe pair of hands manager, has just added to the sense of kind of like meh. And Frank somehow needs to challenge that and make it feel like more of a vibe at Spurs. Like you remember those first few Ange home games, it was incredible, and everyone singing his name and angels and all of that. Like it was a real vibe. And he's a good example. Like, yes, it all ultimately in the league went badly, but for those early weeks and months, there was this sense of like, what if Ange sort of is the Messiah? Like, he might be. With what
you
we've
say
started
Spurs fans just run off vibes, though. Is that what you're saying?
But do you know what I mean? But for any fan, you need to dream that there's like this crazily high ceiling that could happen. It might not. It may well not, but it could. I just don't think that really exists with Frank. There isn't. What fan is being like, oh, but if he gets it right, we could win the league soon. No, I think some fans might be like, if Frank gets it right, that will look like some sort of sensible, competent performances that stabilize us, which is maybe needed. Maybe they need that, and then someone else comes in. Maybe he's the Unai Emery or the Bruce Rioch or whatever. But it's not that sexy a period to live through.
I think Charlie's bang on. And I think the frustration is that Postecoglou could, and I think it was the right decision to sack Postecoglou for the record, and it didn't work. But I think Postecoglou could have been this really important bridge from Mourinho, Nuno and Conte to kind of remind Tottenham what they are and remind Tottenham what fans want to see and what the kind of culture of the club is and what the history and traditions of the club are. And he kind of could have been the guy to decontify and sort of detoxify the club and be a bridge to another progressive coach. And I think that was what Spurs needed to do. It's easy to say with hindsight. And, I was broadly okay with the Frank appointment because I was told by everyone, oh, he just adapts to what he has and he'll be able to scale it up and play nice football. And that hasn't happened yet. But it seems like instead of making Postecoglou that kind of important bridge, they've overcorrected again and gone back to someone who is just all pragmatism and is going to be safety first. And as Charlie says, sets up in their two biggest games of the season against their two biggest rivals in this incredibly negative way that produces kind of record low XGs, which is not sustainable at Tottenham. It's just not. So I think that, as Charlie's touched on, the sort of big question now for Spurs really and for Frank is can he change? Because what he's been doing is not going to work. It's not going to last. Can he change? I can't think of many managers who have radically adjusted their approach. To be honest, it doesn't tend to happen, but that's what's got to happen, I think, if Frank's going to be a success at Spurs.
I think that point's so spot on, though, about just because Ange didn't work in totality, it doesn't mean that that kind of manager is wrong. You're so right. You don't need to completely overcorrect. And that's what teams always do. And we've seen so much of that from Spurs. Like, yes, he wasn't perfect. He did still get them a trophy, but go for someone else. You can still go for someone who plays progressive football and maybe is more of a kind of project manager, for want of a better phrase. Even if he wasn't perfect, you don't have to then sort of go back to what you had before.
Yeah, me and Chris are just sitting here as the therapists, listening to the Spurs purge on us. I mean, like, with all due respect, Chris, I mean, you imagine that the feeling with Eddie Howe, regardless of where Newcastle are right now, is a little bit more in favour just because of the good times already that maybe some Newcastle fans have seen with this team.
Yeah, and I think it was a really good point that Charlie made about wanting fans to dream and having a manager who allows that, because there's a sort of with Eddie Howe, it's strange because when he speaks publicly, he usually says very little. His press conferences can be quite boring, and he's very straight backed. But actually, what he always does is he just taps enough into to making fans want to dream. He never sort of sets a limit on what it should be, and you usually see that with when his team's at best as well. The way that they play on the field, it makes you feel, certainly gets the crowd at St James's Park on board. It makes you feel like anything could be possible. And Newcastle particularly play well against the better teams, but also that idea that he would never diminish the fact that Newcastle fans should dream, that there should be one to win trophies, that there should be one to improve. And so I think that has really helped connect with supporters, as alongside obviously the success on the field, which just reinforces that. And they've been in the Champions League twice. He delivers that trophy and genuine affection for what he is. He's basically totally bought into everything at Newcastle, and he's tapped into something about the identity here and this idea of being different, of being separate from elsewhere, of we're not going to get anything, we're going to have to just take it ourselves. And that sort of, you don't think of that, you think of like nice guy Eddie Howe at Bournemouth, but he really isn't that. He's far more cute than that, and very clever in how he approaches things. And there was a very difficult spell this season. I mean, in November international break went into that, and after Newcastle lost their third successive away match in pretty dire circumstances where they basically played the same way, the same team in a few matches in a row, there were big questions being asked, but he has the full support of the board. Ross Wilson, new sporting director, has come in. He's fully supportive of him. I certainly don't think in the short to medium term, no matter what happens this season, I can't see Eddie Howe being under any real pressure internally. Easy for me to see now, obviously results turn changes, but I just think that alignment that you talked about that isn't necessarily there at Spurs, that wasn't there in Newcastle over the summer because they didn't have a CEO and sporting director. They do now, and it feels like everyone now is on the same page. Fans are buying into that again, and so that has been key to their success since the takeover, and they believe that's going to be key to them kicking on to the next stage as well.
Any money in the pot for January? And any new incomings potentially? I know it's early to talk about it, but we spoke about Man United yesterday, and honestly, social media went wild. Everyone's thrown in names of midfielders in there.
And Newcastle would like to bring in players if they can, but basically any business they will do, they will front load stuff that they would have done next summer anyway, so they definitely could do with improving in fullback positions. Their fullbacks have been injured at various points this season, Lewis Hall and Tino Livramento, and they are a team transformed with the two of them. Fullbacks are essential to Eddie Howe's team, particularly in attack, and to get some greater cover. Kieran Trippier's 35 now, can't get forward like he used to. Dan Burns been covering in at left back, he's not a natural left back, so they'd ideally like to do that. They're really like Keith Smith, Adesa Alkmaar, as so many teams do, but they think if they go aggressive in January, they may have a chance of with that. That seems ambitious. It probably needs Joe Willock to leave as well. But yeah, I could see them doing one or two things potentially, but it's not going to be mass overhaul in January.
Yeah, Dan, Spurs, we know about the injuries, key players as well. I don't know, I look at this squad and I think it's actually quite decent if someone could just do something amazing with it. Because the potential, I think, for this squad, it is quite high.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing for Spurs is getting players back. I mean, Radi Dragusin and Kota Tokai, I think I pronounce it, played in a behind closed door friendly this week, so they have some defensive reinforcements soon. And then the question is, when is Kulusevski going to be fit, I think, and Dom Solanke. Get those two back, then suddenly Frank's attack looks very, very different. Spurs might be able to actually create something and play on the front foot, and let's see. And then I think Maddison is unlikely to play a significant part this season, but toward the end of spring, possibly he could be back in the picture. So rather than doing big things in January, which is always a difficult window to buy, and I think the key will be seeing how these players recover and return.
Okay, well, let's leave it there, gents. Thoroughly appreciated that. Chris, Dan, Charlie, thanks for your time, full house. And thanks also for your purging on Spurs. I appreciate accepting it and listening to it. It's been a joy.
Thank you. I feel therapized.
For more from the Athletic FC podcast, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. We've got top journalists like David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the entire season. Make sure you don't miss an episode of the Athletic FC. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts from.